Okay, great. Our next session is another panel discussion, this one entitled Corporate and Investor Perspectives. Let me hand it off to Ross Levine, who will be the moderator for this session. Thanks, Ross.
Thank you, Debbie. Welcome to the panel on Corporate and Investor Perspectives. My name is Ross Levine. I'm a professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and it really is a great pleasure to be here. As you know, the overall conference brings together market participants, policymakers, and academics to discuss strategies for creating a more environmentally sustainable future. This particular panel brings to the fore the perspectives of practitioners whose actions in response to new pressures and policies determine the impact of those policies on the economy and the environment. We're very fortunate to have three extraordinarily accomplished speakers to help us better understand market developments and responses to policies, pressures, and opportunities. So the three speakers are Alan Haywood, and he's the Senior Vice President, ESG Transformation at BP. And he has led the development at BP of a very publicized movement toward a net zero ambition and strategy for transforming BP from an oil company into an integrated energy company. Second speaker is going to be Richard Manley. He's Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Investing at CPP Investments. And he leads the team there responsible for integrating consideration of ESG, environmental, social, governance issues, including climate risk, into the firm's investments programs. And last of the speakers is going to be Brian Riley. He's Global Head of Sustainable and Impact Banking within the investment bank at Barclays. And he leads the team at Barclays that advises and raises capital for emerging growth companies that are solving environmental and social challenges. We'll follow the same pattern as the earlier session. Each panelist will give a short opening presentation, and then I'll follow up with a few questions. Most importantly, I urge each panelist to respond to the other speakers' remarks, ask some questions. Having the panel be as interactive as possible will bring out the most useful information and insights. At the end, there should be time for some questions from the audience. With that, why don't we proceed in the order on the agenda, starting with Mr. Haywood and then hearing from Mr. Manley and Riley. Alan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ross. Let me just double check that you can hear me okay.
Yes.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for the opportunity. I started off by going and having a look at our sustainability report, just to sort of, think, where does it start in this conversation? And I noted the words which are, we have to take action and put sustainability at the heart of BP. So I thought I'd base my perspective on that mission and seek to cover 3 points, if I may, Ross. The first is the fact of climate change, the urgency of response, and the role that companies like BP have to play. The second is that although climate is the primary concern, there are other environmental priorities, and they go much wider and they're intertwined with social considerations. And the third point, I think, is that pace is key, and pace is the key uncertainty. And the risk, at least in energy, is that we could have a disorderly transition. And the mitigations for that are policy, transparency amongst the main players, and collective action. And I should say at the outset that I am an optimist because I think there is significant societal will. I believe in the ability of technology to deliver solutions at scale, and I have confidence in the innovation of markets inspired by a significant business opportunity. So let me start, Ross, with the climate. And I would say the world has a finite carbon budget, and that budget is running down fast. And it will take all of us to address. So let's not overly debate the choice of pathway and the destination when I think we need to get into action. And I will emphasize that I believe BP and many others are in action. But there are decisions which we need to take as a society, because what we're trying to do is establish a balance here between delivering clean and affordable and reliable energy. Now, within the oil and gas sector, the sort of almost the formerly known oil and gas sector, I think there are two pathways to follow. One is decarbonisation and the other is greening. and that is the reduction of carbon in the energy system, and in the case of greening, the provision of an alternative to fossil fuels. And in BP, we're following that greening pathway. We're looking to reduce the volume of carbon that we introduce into the system by shrinking our production of oil and gas by 40% before 2030, so that we have a more resilient and focused upstream business and refining business. But we do need to remember that the world will still need oil and gas for some decades to come. Even in the IEA net zero scenario, they talk about 24 million barrels of oil demand in 2050. So in the case of BP, we'll be smaller, but more focused on high value opportunities. We will need to increasingly remove carbon from the volumes that we do produce through mechanisms such as carbon capture, usage and storage, through blue hydrogen and operational improvement like methane measurement or electrification. We've talked about eliminating routine flaring in the US by 2025. And I emphasize the and, we'll need to create the alternatives, because without low carbon energy, such as renewable electricity, demand will continue to be met by those fossil fuels. So we've talked in BP about developing 50 gigawatts of renewable energy, electricity by 2030. We've talked about bioenergy, 100,000 barrels a day by 2030. And we've talked about a 10-fold increase in capital from 2019 to 2030. So again, that message, we are in action. Now, as a company which is deep in transition, Ross, and therefore for this context, we ask for support, we ask for feedback. We need to retain funding as a company in transition, and we need policy which supports that transition. So support for some of the elements of transition like gas, albeit progressively decarbonized, for bioenergy, not least in the aviation sector. We want to see carbon pricing globally, and we want to see infrastructure built out which will support electric vehicles, the distribution of hydrogen, and the capture of CO2. Let me just move quickly to my second point, which was the impact that we have on the environment is paramount. And here, we're thinking that sustainability is a foundation of that new strategy. We believe that creating value for our stakeholders more widely, and society, employees, and our shareholders is going to be key to the long-term resilience of our business. And that's why, Ross, when we developed our strategy last year, and you're right, I was sort of very involved in that, we underpinned it with a sustainability frame, which connected the business opportunity to the energy transition and to societal needs and to the environment. So it focused on areas where we felt as BP, we could make the most difference. So we talked about getting ourselves and the planet to net zero in terms of carbon. We talked about improving people's lives and our care for the planet, each of which we underpinned with concrete aims. And those aims included achieving a net positive impact on biodiversity. I'm conscious that that's not easy to measure, but I think we need to work with others such as Fauna and Flora International to come up with some degree of transparency. We wanted to be water positive by 2035, replenishing fresh water that we consume. We said we wouldn't explore in World Heritage sites. In fact, we said we wouldn't explore in new territories. So I think there's a societal connection in everything we're doing, including with the local communities in which we operate, because we need to help manage their transition, as well as BP's transition, as well as the world's transition to this low carbon environment. And whether that means working with our own workforce in the city of Aberdeen, where we see the creation of a wind hub in place of an oil hub, or working with the villagers in our West Papuan sort of sites in Indonesia. It's that theme of just transition. We need to make sure that we don't leave people behind. Now, we're in action in all of this. People probably know that we've started to build an offshore wind business, both in the US and in the UK. We just recently advertised 100 new roles in our low carbon business, and half of those will be filled by internal candidates who we can redeploy and whose skills we can build on. Yesterday, the UK government made announcements as to its net zero commitment. And one of the things it announced was our Northern Insurance Partnership to be an operator of a cluster, an industrial cluster for CCUS, in combination with blue hydrogen, in combination with power. So creating demand for these new energies, but centering them around the infrastructure which we can build out quickly, creates new jobs, 25,000 new jobs. So I think, again, working with government, very important here. And just as I go towards the end, Ross, my third point was pace, if you remember. And I think it's important to remember that we can't flip the switch overnight. We can't have fully clean energy overnight, at least not if we want to keep the lights on and for energy to be affordable to everyone. So pace will be determined by our ability to scale technology and drive the costs lower. And we are seeing costs come down. So I think in wind, we've seen costs drop by 40% over the last 5 years. In solar, it's 50% over the last 5 years. And by the way, we always underestimate that pace of change. That 40 and 50% we predicted 5 years ago would be 15 and 20%. So that's part of that reason for optimism. But if we're going to move at pace, we need policy to support the transition. And there is a quid pro quo, and that quid pro quo is transparency on our part. So we have to have ambition supported by milestones and targets, proven delivery, and ultimately financial delivery. So if I really draw it to a conclusion and hand back to you, I'd say there is an urgent need to transform the energy system. My corporate perspective is that we have the will and the skill in BP, as do others, to contribute to that transition as a greening company and therefore enable that balance between clean and affordable and reliable energy. But we need well-designed policy, we need access to the financial markets, and we need to make sure that we include all the parts of society if collectively we're going to get to the ambitions of Paris. At that point, Ross, let me pause and hand back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Alan, very much. That was great. Richard, would you talk to us, please?
Absolutely. Thank you, Ross. And thank you also, Alan, for those earlier comments. I think we'll see a few synergies between my remarks and what we've already heard. I'm simply going to try and break this down into a few key points. The first, I would say, is that you don't need to take an ethical position on ESG to justify integration into either the corporate strategy or the investment process. That our existing governance framework actually works. We just need to use it. Overall, we need to raise our ambition. This is a whole of economy transition, not just an energy transition. And importantly, there is a big difference between any transition and the optimal transition. That decarbonizing a portfolio is not the same as decarbonizing the global economy, and that success is more likely to be driven by a more ambitious mindset in both the boardroom and the CIO's office than regulation and market forces alone. So I'll start with a quick introduction to CPP Investments. To the extent that people don't know it, we're Canada's largest national pension plan. We manage a little over $500 billion Canadian dollars. We have a legislated mandate that's enshrined in something called the CPPIB Act that reads that our mandate is to maximize long-term investment returns without undue risk, taking into account the factors that may affect the funding of the Canada Pension Plan and its ability to meet its financial obligations. You'll all note it doesn't discuss there any notion of ESG integration or seeking to manage climate risk. So why do we do it? Well, we do it because we firmly believe that this new century has fundamentally changed the nature of business risk. Corporations today are seeking to meet the demands of 8 billion consumers, and the externalities associated with their business activities are creating tipping points. Those tipping points are changing consumer expectations, they are changing regulators' expectations, and boardrooms that don't appreciate that reality are assuming unnecessary risk in charting corporate strategy. That's amplified, I think, by globalization and digitalization that has created arguably one of the most formidable corporate competitive landscapes ever encountered. It's pushing companies to drive the business harder to preserve financial returns at a time, I would say, where the market is increasingly intolerant of companies that miscalibrate risk. So in essence there, we're of the view that companies that are proactive in identifying and managing 21st century business risks and opportunities are best placed to deliver enduring returns over the long term. and by extension, investors doing the same are more likely to outperform. So just reiterating that point, you don't need to take an ethical or norms-based or even concessionary position on ESG to justify integration into corporate strategy or the investment mandate. So then what are our expectations as an owner of companies? We articulate this publicly, we reinforce this each year in our voting activity, but our expectations are that the board will provide oversight and counsel to the executive to ensure that all material business risks and opportunities are integrated into strategy, operations, and public disclosures. That's it. Now, the nature of those risks has probably changed versus where we perceive them to be 20, 30, 40 years ago. I'd say cybersecurity was probably well down the to-do list in the 1980s. I think for most corporations today across the economy, it is at the top of the list with other items. But importantly, the other thing I'd say is that we do believe it's appropriate for issuers to focus on materiality. We want issuers to focus on the drivers of value and the metrics that, if they ace them, will fundamentally de-risk the business. As an institutional investor, we've articulated publicly our support of issuers using the SASB framework and the TCFD. I suspect many of you today have been following the fact there are many more frameworks than that issuers are grappling with. We do expect that these will consolidate over the course of the next couple of years under the auspices of the ISSB. But ultimately, the main point there is really focus on materiality when integrating this into the corporate setting or the investment mandate. Next point, the whole of economy transition. Yes, the energy complex is the largest piece of the pie, but we will not get to net zero unless we take the whole of the economy to net zero. The next thing I'd say is we talk a lot about a transition, but we need the optimal transition. And the optimal transition, as we've defined it, is the most greenhouse gases out of the economy with the least impact on the economy. And that is not going to be charted by technology alone. That is going to be charted by the interplay between regulation, innovation, and carbon prices, and to an extent, then consumer behavior and the provision of capital to put in place the infrastructure to decarbonize. What I will say, though, is the fan of outcomes today for fiduciaries seeking to deploy capital in either the corporate setting or the investor setting are still very wide. The fan of outcomes on regulation, the fan of outcome on technology costs, and on carbon prices is not making it easy to deploy capital at the pace that we require to transition our economy to net zero in the next 3 decades. What I will say, though, is it is very clear that any increase in certainty on each of these will debottleneck capital flows and accelerate investment. The other point I would add is that Wright's Law is coming to the transition. I think, Alan, you heard Alan talk about the change in solar and wind. It wasn't that long ago that the naysayers were saying wind and solar will never work. They are now the backbone of many corporations' transition strategies. But we hear people speak exactly the same way today about hydrogen and CCS. And my overarching message here is, as we ask of companies that they seek to transition, we need to be respectful that they are acting in a fiduciary capacity and shouldn't be compelling them to bet the ranch on what I've called climate Betamax. We need to be shooting for climate Netflix. We cannot afford cycles of obsolete technology to be written to zero. We need to be pursuing some of the transformational technology that is likely to become economic, not only as a combination of Wright's Law, but also as more corporations are incented by regulation and economics to mobilize their human and financial capital. The next point, divestment versus engagement. Decarbonizing a fund doesn't decarbonize the economy. We need the real economy to decarbonize. As an active owner, the only real lever we have to do that is engagement with our portfolio companies. However, we do need to respect the triad, and by that I mean the discrete roles, responsibilities, and rights that accrue to owners, boards, and executives. The board is responsible to the company. but accountable to owners. As I articulated earlier, our ESG expectations, our climate expectations are just as transparent. And that is that we expect the board to put in place a clear governance structure for climate oversight, ensure that the executive has identified and quantified climate risks and opportunities, integrated those insights into strategy, operations, and public disclosures. And effective the voting season that we've just been through, we have publicly articulated that any company that contributed to the fund's climate risk, we would conclude reasonably that a company not doing that its board was derelict in its duty to act in our company's best interests and withhold support for the reappointment of those directors. That has resulted in votes against directors this season. It was over 50, I think it's 53 of them during the season that's just passed. More importantly, and I think more worthy of celebration, is 19 companies committed to us over the whole season to deliver a TCFD report by the next AGM in order to preserve our support for their directors. Now, the last point I'd make is how we get there. There's a lot of talk about regulation, market forces, but ultimately, we won't deliver the desired outcome we seek as a compliance exercise. Importantly, those that can transition deserve access to capital. But the flip side of that is those who cannot transition, at least in line with peers, are likely to lose access to capital. Now, regulation, I think, does risk bringing a compliance mindset to ESG more broadly and climate strategy. The market force is there, but let's be clear, the only way we will realize the full potential of the opportunity at hand is a more enlightened mindset in the boardroom. These are pertinent business risks and opportunities that, if managed or captured, will create durable value for the very long term. And my closing comment would be that we remain ready as a fund to fund the transition by direct investments in enabling technologies, renewables, carbon capture, nature-based solutions, green buildings, but also ready to support companies in the provision of capital to transition their businesses where they articulate that as feasible and accretive to value creation for the long term. So with that, Ross, I'll hand back. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. Brian, it's all yours.
Great. Thanks, Ross. Are you guys hearing that feedback? Okay, there we go.
Yeah, good.
Well, look, Richard, I loved your analogy to Betamax and Netflix. I hope we find many Netflix and climate technologies. But look, Alan and Richard made some fantastic points. I in particular, the one that resonated with me was that you don't need to take an ethical or concessionary position around this. I think those were Richard's words, but Alan also alluded to it. I'd love to find some time to come back and make some comments on that. But as Ross mentioned, I'm Brian Riley. I'm Global Head of Sustainable and Impact Banking at Barclays, which is a standalone coverage group in investment banking that we formed exactly 2 years ago in October of 2019, really at the direction of our CEO, Jess Staley. We have 24 bankers globally, and what we're doing is two things. One, Ross mentioned at the outset, is we're advising and raising capital for emerging growth companies or businesses are solving environmental or social issues. So a lot of the technologies that both Richard and Alan referenced, but it cuts across electrification and hydrogen, biofuel, carbon capture. We're doing a lot around agricultural technology. Water is another vertical for us, and then recycling and the circular economy. But the other thing that we do with our team is that we're advising our existing banking clients and helping them support them in their own energy transition. So advising on important themes, disclosure, as well as acquisitions and disposition. So maybe I'll just make a couple of quick comments on both of these functions, and then I'm happy to drill down on a little bit more later on Q&A. I would just say on the emerging growth side of our business, the appetite in the capital markets, particularly in the U.S., to finance many of these emerging technologies has accelerated at a much, much quicker pace than I envisioned it would when we really started this effort 2 years ago. Look, certainly that's in part due to the risk-on posture that we've seen across all asset classes, but the capital formation, right? The capital formation around sustainability in both the public and the private markets has been significant. And there was an article about it this morning on Bloomberg, but between the VC funds, the family offices, and the private equity firms, the amount of capital targeting these emerging technologies around climate has increased exponentially, right? So TPG has raised a $7 billion climate fund. Brookfield's out raising a $12.5 billion fund. General Atlantic, $4 billion, and those are just a few examples. Not to mention folks like CPPIP and others targeting investments in this space. And then you've got the strategics raising large VC arms, particularly the technology companies. The SPAC market has helped these emerging companies. A lot of money has been raised in this space over the last 12 months through SPAC. We all know that market is coming back down to earth, but even without SPACs, there has been so much capital formation around sustainability broadly that we expect activity to remain strong. We expect the activity to be able to finance a lot of these companies that ultimately could be part of BP or other companies, but on a standalone basis, the capital is there for them to be financed today. There will be bumps in the road. There always are. On the other side of our business, so again, advising our large corporate clients on ESG, I think we heard a little bit of this in the previous panel, and certainly heard it from Alan, but there really has been a big change, I would say, in the mindset of U.S. corporates over the last 18 to 24 months. In my observation, the corporates that we talk to in the U.S., it is accepted that ESG is here to stay, and it's just going to get more and more important. And that's because I think CEOs, CFOs, boards are seeing some pretty powerful forces at work. These are forces that European corporates saw many, many years ago, but we really just start to see come into the fray recently in the last 18 to 24 months. But first and foremost, which is really a lot what Richard was touching on, is the increased pressure that companies are seeing from capital providers. Every investor, whether or not that investor has a dedicated ESG fund, in my opinion, there's way too much focus on these public dedicated ESG funds because every investor is focused on this. And that's partly because they're institutional investors, the big allocators of capital are demanding it. So you've got the push from the capital providers, and perhaps there's no greater example of that than what we've seen recently at ExxonMobil. But at the same time, you also have the pull from customers, and that cuts across all slices of GDP. Yes, we have conscious consumerism, which is growing more and more prevalent, but this is not only about retailers and consumers, it really applies to all companies. I like to use the example that if you're a steel manufacturer, and if your automotive OEM clients are calculating their own Scope 3 emissions, guess what? You're part of that calculation, right? So the OEM is now going to start demanding that you, the steel manufacturer, start reducing your emissions. So push from capital providers, you got the pull from customers. Now you got the regulators, as one of the panelists said on the previous panel. Politicians are always late to come to the fray, but now you're starting to see it again. Certainly we've had it in Europe for quite some time, but I think the Biden administration's release last Friday, actually, of the report saying climate poses systemic risk to the U.S. financial system is a great example of that. So we could talk more about it in Q&A, but right now I would say you do have a lot of corporates, and it's across all sectors. It's not just oil and gas. It's across every sector, working hard to not only address business model issues and operational issues, but also working on things like how to engage with the buy side and working on getting disclosure right without any regulatory guidance. Maybe I could just comment for a minute on the point that that both Richard and Alan made about how does it need to be an ethical issue, right? It goes to the question of is there a conflict between your environmental and social goals, for that matter, with your traditional fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders? And it's an age-old question, and I think back to about 6 or 7 years ago when we started to underwrite IPOs for B Corps. There were 2 in particular that we did at Barclays about 5 or 6 years ago, and you heard from a lot of public shareholders. By the way, didn't even know what B Corps were at the time. But saying, well, what about me? Is the fiduciary responsibility owned to me? How does that square with the duties that you now have to other stakeholders? I think the good news is, and it sounds like Alan and Richard would agree with this, that the answer to this question and this so-called dilemma is getting easier by the day, in that we are beginning to see a convergence between environmental goals and traditional fiduciary responsibilities. I always hate to sound like I'm talking my own book, but more and more investors, right, those to whom that fiduciary duty is owed, are trying to truly integrate, as Richard said, ESG factors into their financial analyses of companies to arrive at intrinsic value and expected returns. All you got to do is look at, engine number 1, that tiny little hedge fund that won, 3 board seats on ExxonMobil's board, right? They are measuring the value that companies create or destroy for both shareholders and stakeholders. Look at that, the relationship between those 2 groups, and trying to quantify the impact in dollars. So intuitively, it makes a lot of sense, right? Working ESG into the fundamental analysis, right? The argument being that ESG factors are financially material, right? They can affect top line growth. They can affect costs and margins. They can affect regulatory and legal intervention. So putting a dollar value on externalities and then measuring the relationship between the externalities and the cost that the company incurs to internalize those externalities intuitively makes a lot of sense. But then if you read some of the literature that engine number 1 has put out, they've shown empirical evidence going back 10 years of a high correlation between the variation, the level of value created or destroyed for stakeholders and then future financial performance. So my point is, you're going to see more and more asset managers do this, deploying a similar approach. And as you do, this so-called conflict, to the extent it even exists, between environmental goals and traditional fiduciary responsibilities to shareholders, is mitigated or eventually just disappears. So I'll pause there and
Thank you very much.
quickly, I'll pause there and happy to go to Q&A.
Thank you, Brian and Alan and Richard. So I want to dig a little bit deeper on a theme that all of you focused on, and that's at the heart of the conference. Alan mentioned it. He's coming from it a little bit different perspective, but Alan mentioned in the context of a partnership between what goes on with policy and things like infrastructure and pricing, and how firms are going to respond, including engaging in the community. And Richard and Brian mentioned it in the context of there being less and less a sort of conflict between sort of traditional fiduciary responsibilities and ethical perspectives on ESG and the environment, and more that this is part of what goes into making a profitable investment. So the question I had was to focus back on the policy theme of the conference. And so to Alan, it's like, what more precisely are the ways in which government should be designing policies that would facilitate firms' ability to effectively invest in ESG? And then back more to when we turn to Richard and Brian, I guess, similar type question that there is this movement by investment funds. A lot of money is flowing in, but those funds may be flowing in there based on the expectations that certain types of policies are going to be realized that make those investments profitable. So it's a similar type of question: is what are the types of things that governments will have to do in order to both keep those funds flowing and to have them be used in the most efficient way? So that's a pretty long question, but Alan, please, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the things that policymakers could do.
Thanks, Ross. I mean, going right back to the start of your question, now, certainly from my perspective, what do we need? I think it's very easy for policy, and we're seeing it in the taxonomies which are coming out, to sort of recognize what is unquestionably a good destination, and that is green technologies. But I think one of the risks is that by defining something as quite clearly good, it runs the risk of defining everything else almost by definition as not good. And my point would be, this is a transition. And we need to understand that, again, for that sort of clean and reliable and affordable, that, there's a lot of transition, including in the traditional businesses of oil and gas. And therefore, be careful not to, in identifying something positive, exclude everything else. I think what we need is support for the concept of a company or an economy or a technology which is in transition. Now, we need to understand what that trajectory looks like and assure ourselves that the company is on that trajectory, so is transitioning at the right pace. But I think, understanding that transitional element, that's very important. And that does lead you to say, not only do we have the green technologies, but we have, I'll use the word greening again, and that could be biofuels. It could be the use of carbon capture and sequestration for progressively decarbonizing gas. It could be the role of blue hydrogen, all alongside the green technologies. So I think that would be the first thing I would say. The second thing where we've advocated for is, in a way, let's be clear on the trajectory and on the destination in the form of sending the economic signal, and the clearest economic signal is with a carbon price. Because I do think that having that clarity sends clear messages to all who can act. It encourages those who can, as it were, do more, because they have the technologies which can go further to do so. It shouldn't stop people who feel it's a struggle to sort of decarbonize from progressing as far as they can, but at least it sort of prices up the technologies and the trajectories correctly. And then I think the other piece I would say is, this is a world in which we're going to need trillions of dollars of investment. Who can support some of that investment? Well, government can, or some of the risks which people are taking. So to what extent can government give assurance to people who are investing, let's say in a power project, that there is a market for that power and that there is a price for that power? Because otherwise there is a danger that the risks are very significant. And that creates an inertia which stops us developing those technologies at scale. And I think it's the application of the technologies at scale which will drive down the costs. So hopefully there's a virtuous circle of invest, drive down the costs, which will support more investment. But I think quite a lot of that is to understand the trajectories and to understand the role that policy can take here. Thanks, Ross.
Oh, thank you, Alan. I guess we can keep the same ordering, but so Richard, I also wanted to hear your views on this. Sort of what are the types of policies that are going to be necessary to sustain these types of investments and to funnel them into productive areas?
Absolutely. And maybe, Ross, if you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to kind of close out the discussion with regards to fiduciary mandate.
Sure.
Some of you may know that prior to joining CPP, I led Goldman Sachs' ESG research for a decade, and a lot of the development that they did in building the GS Sustain product. And I'll share a pretty vivid memory I have of a conversation with a portfolio manager in 2010, where I said I'm the ESG analyst, and he said, "That's great, I've got a team at the end of the corridor you should speak to." And I had to think on my feet, and I said, look, let me reframe that. I'm here to help you identify and manage 21st century business risk. Now, I'll frame that to everyone in the audience. If we had a debate about whether fiduciaries in any capacity should be seeking to identify and manage 21st century business risks and opportunities, would we be having this conversation at all? And my expectation is the answer is no. So I actually think ESG has a branding issue, and if we reposition this and align it with vocabulary that we would typically find in a business or investing setting, this conversation would be closed. In terms of creating the right incentives and policies, I just want to maybe frame for a moment how we got here. Like, the GDP of our planet today is what it is because as a species, we've been free riding on our climate for 150 years of industrial revolution. And we need to somehow work out how to internalize 150 years worth of activity in another 3 decades. And unfortunately, a large amount of the investment we need to make is not going to be particularly productive. We will be substituting existing productive capacity with equivalent productive capacity for hopefully the same amount of capital employed, but for no expansion in productivity. And we're expecting fiduciaries to commit, as Alan says, trillions of dollars of capital to do that. And I would contend that anything we can do to provide them regulatory certainty or economic certainty to catalyze the deployment of that capital will accelerate the outcome. And the way I'll frame it is this: most companies will be looking at these investment decisions, appreciating that in a lot of instances, they are likely to raise the marginal cost of their product or service. Why would I seek to proactively raise my marginal cost speculatively without some degree of assurance that that is going to be the operating environment I need to perform in anyway? And I think providing visibility that actions as they are currently, or processes as they're currently conducted, will not be possible beyond future dates, in time, is likely to provide people the confidence that this is now not the speculative deployment of capital. This is future-proofing my business. And I think we all know, and we've seen, as I said, Wright's Law is coming to these transition technologies. As we scale the deployment of these technologies, the unit costs of deploying them fall, and the momentum and the enthusiasm to deployment is going one way. And I think the other certainty, or the other opportunity, is providing clarity as to what and when will be included in carbon markets. Because as soon as people realize there will be a dollar associated with, I'd say, a penalty to emit or a source of compensation to abate, that will be another important input into the decision making of fiduciaries across the capital complex to further accelerate our transition.
As an economist, this is these discussions from practitioners are a lovely thing to hear. Brian.
Yeah, look, I would just, I guess I'm not seconding, I'm thirding the point about putting a price on carbon. Amen to that. I don't need to say anything more than what Richard and Alan just said, but that is absolutely critical. I would also say amen to what Alan said. This is energy transition. It's transition. And I'll say that word over and over and over again. This is not going to happen overnight. So having policies in place that are facilitating the transition. We are not all going to be driving electric vehicles tomorrow. At some point we will. We can all take a view as to when that is, but it's not happening anytime soon. So this is a transition, and smart policies need to be in place to support that. The one thing that I would add from a capital market standpoint is disclosure. The bottom line is investors are demanding disclosure more and more. Corporates are providing it. I think over 90% of S&P 500 companies. Sorry, Alan, I just refer to the S&P 500, but It's even more in Europe, now publish sustainability reports in some form or another. But the problem is that we all know, right? There's no standardized approach to reporting metrics. I think there's over 100 corporate sustainability standard initiatives out there. So companies are confused as to what's needed. What should they be spending their time and money on with respect to ESG reporting? And as a result, there's lack of consistency. So I would argue that this is one area where most corporates and investors would welcome regulation. Corporates are publishing the information or some information already. Having standardized metrics within industry sectors would make it easier for everyone. As I think Richard mentioned earlier, in the meantime, many corporates have chosen TCFD and/or SASB as a framework for disclosure. I do think the buy side is growing accustomed to both TCFD and SASB. Some companies are doing a good job breaking out what is financially material in their sustainability reports. Others are really quantifying the impact that their business can have on the environment. A lot of really good thought leaders out there are going out and doing materiality assessments to really try to get from their stakeholders what's material. But they really, really need the regulators to come down and define this. And look, the SEC certainly seems to be prioritizing environmental disclosure. Our government relations colleagues at Barclays, and I think this is the prevailing view, believe the likely outcome on disclosure rules next year will be some combination of quantitative metrics and qualitative guidance with respect to what could be material. So, scope 1, scope 2 emissions likely be required to be reported on a historical basis. Scope 3 is going to be a little bit more difficult for the SEC to get their hands around. Maybe they take a more principled approach. In my opinion, I think it is, while it is difficult for the SEC to perhaps provide quantitative metrics on scope 3, and perhaps they believe that's beyond their mandate, a lack of visibility or accountability on scope 3 is problematic. Right? I can offset my scope 1 emissions in the carbon credit market. I could solve scope 2 by buying renewable power. That's all great, but the real impact to the environment may well be, and often is, beyond the four walls of my company. So in my supply chain. So if we want to hold companies' feet to the fire on this and really allow the capital markets to do the work, we got to figure out how to mandate that. And there's some really, really interesting emerging technology companies out there that are helping corporates and asset managers solve this problem. There's one in particular that I think is very far along, which if you have the framework, they're enabling companies to actually do it. And I think that's critical.
So Brian, a quick follow-up question. So in advising companies that are seeking to raise money, I guess I was curious, what are some of the issues that arise, or sort of typical pieces of advice that you need to give to companies to facilitate their access to capital markets?
Yeah.
Or sort of that intermediation in terms of what are the frictions there that you help overcome to get them money? Yeah,
Ross, it's a great question, and we start with let's just use for an example. I mean, we do this with existing public companies, but also private companies that are looking to go public. Start with the statement that ESG is a journey, and it's a journey for everyone. And I think that there's a tendency on the part of particularly U.S. corporates, maybe less so in Europe, to really hold their cards close to the vest around ESG because they don't really know. They're afraid of what they don't know. What I like to say to them is, guess what? Nobody knows, right? And this is a journey for all of us. And I think, what I like to say is, nothing wrong with going out and admitting what you don't know and what you're working on. So for a private company, our advice to them is get in front of it. The regulation on the disclosure is going to come. It's going to happen. again, we don't necessarily know what form. I think many people on this Zoom event have probably commented on the SEC proposal, but we don't know what form it's going to come in. But get in front of it and start to do the work now. Start to measure, the low-hanging fruit, the scope 1 and scope 2. Start to talk about how you're going to come out, and if you haven't done it already, measure yourself by KPIs and metrics. Start to evaluate scope 3 emissions. In our conversations with investors, particularly public investors, that's what they want to see. They just want to see honesty, and they want to see a recognition by management teams that it is a journey, and they're starting and they're taking it seriously, and they're getting in front of what's likely to come from the regulators.
Thank you. Actually, and then Alan, there's a couple of questions in the chat, and I'm going to summarize them and merge them into my own question as well, which is about some of the particulars with BP. So I'll give you sort of a broad question, and you can pick and choose how you want to address it. So one is sort of internally this movement toward the ambitions of less emissions. What were sort of the challenges that you faced and that were confronted in BP? So what type of recommendations might you give to other firms that wanted to embrace such a change? And then relatedly, and this is sort of the questions from the Q&A, how do you see your firm or other firms sort of managing this process of investing in more environmentally friendly energy and fossil fuels? As you pointed out, and as Brian just pointed out, this is going to be a transition. And I guess any insights that you have on how BP and how you think other firms are going to manage that, I'd be very curious about. So with that very unwieldy question, I'll hand it off to you to make it coherent.
Thank you. So the first thing I would go to is that part of creating the change. I mean, I think it's actually very important to step back from what you're used to and think, where is the marketplace going? Where is the customer going? And I think it's clear that the customer is asking for a clean product. I mean, it's clear from the science that there needs to be a change. Now, inevitably, I think a company is, by definition, experienced in what it does. So the question you often go is, how do we improve what we do? I think we tried to step back and say, just park that for a moment. Where is the world going, and what is the nature of the offer the customer will want? And then we said the nature of energy, I mean, both in terms of it would be electricity, it would be renewable electricity, it would probably be localized, the markets would become more fractured and more complex. The world was a changing, and we need to anticipate some of that change. Now, I think, therefore, we said, we need to run a traditional business, which is smaller. We talked about 40% smaller by 2030 in the upstream, but it needs to be even more efficient. So we need the skills of our workforce to be even more focused on the high quality barrels, which will generate the larger margins, which can sort of sustain uncertainty, but also which can afford decarbonization. In the meantime, we need to build up the new skills. And, I should never forget, we're looking to sort of, increase our downstream business. Sometimes people forget, and that includes convenience retail and, selling cups of coffee. There's a portfolio approach. But, inevitably people, as it were, mourn for the past. But what we need to say is we've got a future. It's a future which we think we have the will and the skill to adapt to. And it's a very exciting one. And it certainly is going to attract new members of staff, as well as hopefully energize, people who've been in the company a little bit longer. And some of the skills which we have in the traditional businesses of, let's say, offshore oil can actually be redeployed into offshore wind. So I think sort of recognizing where the world is going and taking the excitement of that opportunity. Now, it has a de-risking approach as well. So that's the first thing. And then on the, it's almost a question of pace. How quickly do you transition into the new? There is a balance, and that balance has to be determined by financial discipline. It has to be determined by our human capability to do the new things. And certainly one of the questions which we get asked, Ross, is there a risk that you're going to chase after the new opportunity, possibly be involved in reducing the margins in those new opportunities, and be driven by almost the bright, shiny thing of the future? And we have to say, no, we're being very disciplined. If we see a project which we like, which meets our economic hurdles, and yes, to one of the questions in the chat, we do use an internal carbon price. We're very transparent about it, $100 in 2030, rising to $250 in 2050. Things have to meet hurdle rates. And if they don't, we won't do them. And although we talk about the projects which we are doing, we talk about a pipeline of solar projects, for instance, growing from 4 to 21 gigawatts in the last couple of years. We can also talk about 13 gigawatts of opportunities we've turned down. So we're not just chasing after things. There has to be that financial discipline. We also need the oil and gas business to generate cash, because that cash will be redeployed into the new activity. So there is both a transition in the demand, but there's also a transition in our revenues and our capital investment as we sort of move from one to the other. And there is kind of a synergy and almost a symbiosis in the early days as we transition, Ross.
Thank you very much, Alan. Richard, I wanted to give you the final word, either to react to what Alan and Brian has said, or to communicate some thoughts that you didn't have time to articulate earlier before we take a break.
No, I think it's been great to hear and actually see, Alan talk about BP, but actually watch BP's journey. I think it's very clear that once the board of a company has embraced the opportunity set, the capacity needs to be built. This is not easy. I said it earlier on, we're trying to do 150 years of work in a pretty short timetable. But the mobilizing, and I've said this in multiple public forums, big energy has been in a permanent state of innovation for a century. Every geological challenge, every engineering challenge, every economic challenge, they've deployed, when incented the right way, the human capital and financial capital to work out how to adapt. And in the context of that 100 years, we haven't really had a clear incentive to abate greenhouse gas emissions, whether economic or regulatory, until relatively recently. But it's very clear that as boards and executive teams embrace the evolving operating environment ahead of them and seek to mobilize their capital to do the hard work of, one, for many companies still working out what their emissions are, two, their capacity organically to abate those emissions through efficiency, through greening of power supplies, to investments economic today, to investments that will become economic at higher carbon prices, and ultimately determine which parts of the portfolio may need to be wound down. We are, I think, going as an industry and frankly humanity to get far greater visibility on the opportunity set for the economy to transition. And with that, I'd say not only the ability to more effectively price risk, but increasingly ensure that capital gets to the parts of the economy that need to transition. Because we've seen something very clearly over the last 3 weeks. It's far easier to destroy supply of energy than it is demand for energy. And when we don't get those two moving together, we can create some pretty funky outcomes. So I think great to see the largest companies in the economy embrace this opportunity and mobilize their capacity, and hopefully something we will continue to see move across industries and across the capital structure in the years ahead.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Alan. Thank you, Brian. I've learned a tremendous amount from the three of you, and I am sure that the other participants did as well. I think we have to close this session, and I'll hand it over to Debbie.
Great. Thanks, Ross, and to the panelists for another really excellent session. We have a very short break of only 5 minutes, but so we'll be back soon. Stretch your legs and see everyone then.